You are absolutely worthless. Do you understand me? Worthless. The words cut through the morning air of the Charleston mansion like shards of broken glass, and Margaret Whitmore's face twisted with disgust as she stared at the coffee stain spreading across her pristine white tablecloth. Rosa Jenkins stood frozen, her dark hands trembling as she clutched the silver serving tray against her chest, her eyes fixed on the floor, because she had learned long ago that meeting Mrs. Whitmore's gaze only made things worse. The 52-year-old maid had worked in this house for 11 years, and in all that time, she had never once received a kind word from the woman who signed her paychecks. But today felt different. Today felt like something was about to break that could never be put back together. Margaret rose from her chair at the head of the enormous dining table, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached Rosa with the slow, deliberate steps of a predator cornering its prey. And when she stopped just inches from the maid's face, her perfume was so strong it made Rosa's eyes water. I have the governor coming for dinner tonight, and you cannot even pour a simple cup of coffee without destroying my grandmother's antique linens, Margaret hissed, her voice dripping with contempt that had been building for years. Contempt for this woman she saw as beneath her, as less than human, as nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded when it broke. Rosa wanted to explain that her hands had been shaking because she had been up all night with her sick grandson, wanted to tell this cruel woman that she had not slept more than 2 hours because little Marcus had a fever that would not break. But she knew her words would fall on deaf ears that had never once cared to listen. I'm sorry. Ma'am, it won't happen again, Rosa whispered, the words she had spoken 1,000 times before, the words that tasted like surrender and shame on her tongue, and she began to carefully lift the stained tablecloth while Margaret watched with her arms crossed and her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. In the doorway, unseen by both women, 28-year-old Daniel Whitmore stood watching the scene unfold, and something in his chest tightened with a pain that had nothing to do with the cancer that was slowly consuming his body from the inside out. He had come home to Charleston 3 weeks ago after the doctors in New York told him there was nothing more they could do, that the treatments had failed, that he had maybe 6 months if he was lucky, and he had returned to this house of cold marble and colder hearts because there were things he needed to say before he left this world forever. Daniel watched Rosa's shoulders shake slightly as she worked to clean up the mess, watched his mother's face remain hard and unforgiving, and he thought about all the years he had witnessed scenes just like this one. All the years he had stayed silent because he was too afraid or too weak to speak the truth that burned inside him like a flame that refused to die. His mother did not know he was sick yet because he had not found the courage to tell her. But watching her cruelty toward Rosa made him realize that courage was something he could no longer afford to waste. Not when his time was running out like sand through an hourglass that someone had tipped too far. Rosa finished cleaning and hurried toward the kitchen with her head bowed. And she did not see Daniel standing in the shadows, did not see the tears forming in his eyes as he watched her disappear through the swinging door that separated the servant's world from the world of the wealthy. Margaret smoothed her silk blouse and returned to her seat, picking up her phone to scroll through messages as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just torn a piece from another human being's soul. And Daniel felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked away for far too long finally breaking free of its chains. He thought about Rose's hands, those gentle dark hands that had wiped his tears when he was a child and his mother was too busy with her charity galas and country club luncheons. Those hands that had made him chicken soup when he was sick and his mother had not even bothered to check on him. Those hands that had held his small fingers and walked him to school on his first day when Margaret had claimed she had a migraine and could not possibly leave the house. The memories flooded back with such force that Daniel had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. And he realized that the woman his mother called worthless was the only person in this house who had ever made him feel truly loved, truly seen, truly valued for who he was rather than what he could become. He made a decision in that moment, standing in the shadows of his childhood home with death whispering in his ear. And it was a decision that would change everything for everyone in ways none of them could possibly imagine. That evening, Rosa moved through the dining room like a ghost, silent and invisible as she served the governor and his wife alongside Margaret and her husband Richard, who had flown in from his business trip specifically for this dinner that his wife had been planning for months. Daniel had declined to join them, claiming he was tired from his travels. But the truth was, he could not stomach sitting at that table and pretending everything was fine when his world was falling apart and his heart was full of words that needed to be spoken before it was too late. From his bedroom window on the second floor, he watched the lights of Charleston twinkle in the distance and thought about Rosa in her small apartment across town, probably tending to her sick grandson while worrying about whether she would still have a job tomorrow after the coffee incident this morning. He pulled out his laptop and began to type, his fingers moving across the keyboard with an urgency that surprised him. And the words that flowed onto the screen were words he had been carrying inside him for 28 years. Words that told a story his mother had tried to bury so deep that even she had forgotten where she had hidden it. The document grew longer as the night stretched on, and Daniel did not stop until the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky, painting the room in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of the sunrises he used to watch with Rosa when he was small and could not sleep, when she would make him warm milk and sit with him on the back porch and tell him stories about her grandmother in Georgia and the farm where she grew up surrounded by love and laughter and family. 3 weeks passed, and Daniel's condition worsened rapidly, faster than even the doctors had predicted, and he knew he could not wait any longer to reveal the truth that had been eating at him for as long as he could remember. He asked his mother to invite Rosa to the house on a Saturday morning, telling Margaret that he had something important to discuss with the household staff about his future care needs. And though his mother rolled her eyes and muttered something about the inconvenience of it all, she agreed because she had finally noticed that her son was not well, finally realized that something was terribly wrong with the boy she had never quite figured out how to love. Rosa arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, wearing her Sunday best because she had been told this was an important meeting, and her heart was pounding with fear that she was about to be fired, that the coffee incident had been the final straw, that after 11 years of service she was about to be thrown away like yesterday's garbage. She walked into the formal living room where Margaret sat in her favorite armchair. Richard stood by the fireplace, looking uncomfortable, and Daniel lay on the sofa, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth of the spring morning. And when Rosa saw how thin and pale he had become, she had to press her hand against her mouth to keep from crying out. The boy she had helped raise, the child she had loved as fiercely as her own children, was dying right in front of her eyes, and no one had bothered to tell her. No one had thought she deserved to know that her heart was about to be shattered into a million pieces. "Please sit down, Rosa," Daniel said, his voice weak but steady, and he gestured to the chair beside the sofa where he could see her face clearly, where he could watch her eyes as he told her the story that would change her life forever. Margaret shifted impatiently in her seat, checking her watch as if she had somewhere more important to be, and Richard stared at the floor like a man who already knew what was coming and wished he could be anywhere else in the world. Daniel reached into the folder beside him and pulled out a stack of papers, documents he had spent the last 3 weeks gathering from lawyers and private investigators and dusty courthouse records in counties across 3 different states, and his hands shook as he held them up for everyone to see. "Mother, before I die, there is something you need to know about Rosa. Something that Father told me on his deathbed 5 years ago. Something he made me promise to reveal when the time was right," Daniel began, and Margaret's face went pale as she gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Rosa looked between mother and son with confusion clouding her gentle eyes, not understanding what any of this could possibly have to do with her, not knowing that in the next few minutes her entire understanding of her own life was about to be turned completely upside down. "Your father never told you anything, Daniel. He was delirious at the end. You cannot possibly believe the ramblings of a dying man," Margaret said quickly, too quickly, and the panic in her voice confirmed what Daniel had suspected all along, that his mother knew exactly what secret had been buried for more than 5 decades. Daniel ignored her interruption and turned to Rosa. taking her withered hand in his own thin fingers, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with a tenderness that made Rosa's eyes fill with tears she did not yet understand. Rosa, 62 years ago, in a small town in Mississippi, a wealthy white family had a daughter who fell in love with a black man who worked on their property, and when she became pregnant, her family was so horrified that they sent her away to have the baby in secret. Daniel said softly, watching Rosa's face as the words began to sink in like stones dropping into still water. Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and her voice was shrill with desperation as she shouted at her son to stop, to not say another word, to let sleeping dogs lie and dead secrets stay buried where they belonged in the darkness of the past. But Daniel had not come this far to be silenced now, had not spent his dying days uncovering the truth only to let his mother's shame win one final victory. And he continued speaking as if Margaret had not said anything at all, his eyes never leaving Rosa's face. That baby girl was given to a black family to raise, and she was never told who her real parents were, never told that her biological mother was Margaret Whitmore's own mother, Elizabeth Hartley, which means that you, Rosa Jenkins, are my mother's half-sister, Daniel said, and the words hung in the air like thunder echoing across a summer sky, heavy and world-shaking and impossible to ignore. Rosa's hand flew to her chest as if her heart had suddenly stopped beating, and she looked at Margaret with new eyes, searching for the resemblance she had never thought to look for before. The same nose, the same shape of the eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw that Rosa saw every morning when she looked in the mirror. Margaret collapsed back into her chair, all the color drained from her face, and for the first time in 11 years, Rosa saw something other than contempt in her employer's eyes. She saw fear and shame and the desperate look of a woman whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around her like a sandcastle meeting the tide. The documents Daniel held contained DNA test results, birth certificates, letters between Elizabeth Hartley and the family who had raised Rosa, everything needed to prove beyond any doubt that the woman Margaret had called worthless, the woman she had treated like something less than human, was her own flesh and blood, her own sister. My father found out the truth years ago when he was going through your mother's papers after she died, Daniel continued, his voice growing weaker but no less determined, and he was going to tell you, Margaret, but then he saw how you treated Rosa, saw the hatred in your heart, and he decided to wait, to hope that you would change, to believe that someday you would learn to see her as a person worthy of respect. Rosa sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face as decades of mistreatment suddenly took on a new and even more painful meaning, and she thought about all the times she had wondered why Mrs. Whitmore seemed to hate her so specifically, so personally, and now she understood that somewhere deep inside, Margaret must have sensed the connection and resented it with every fiber of her being. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, marking the seconds as they stretched into minutes, and no one seemed to know what to say or do now that the truth had finally been dragged into the light where it could no longer be ignored. Richard cleared his throat and quietly left the room, a man who had always known when a situation was beyond his ability to fix, and his footsteps echoed down the hallway until even that sound faded into silence. Margaret finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, cracked and broken in ways Rosa had never heard before. I always suspected, there was something in the way Mother looked at you when you first came to work here, something in the way she insisted I hire you, something she never explained, but I could feel it in my bones, Margaret said, and the admission seemed to cost her something precious, some piece of her pride that she had guarded so carefully for so long. Rosa stood on shaking legs and walked to where her half-sister sat. This woman who had made her life miserable for 11 years. This woman who had called her worthless and treated her like dirt. This woman who was the only family Rosa had left now that her mother had passed and her children had moved away to build lives of their own in cities far from Charleston. For a long moment, Rosa just looked at Margaret, really looked at her, and she saw past the expensive clothes and the perfect makeup to the frightened woman underneath. A woman who had been running from the truth for so long that she had forgotten how to stand still and face it. Then Rosa did something that made Daniel's heart swell with pride even as his body continued to fail him. Something that proved everything he had always believed about the woman who had raised him with love when his own mother could not. She reached out and took Margaret's hand. "I forgive you," Rosa said simply, and those 3 words carried more power than all the anger and resentment she could have unleashed, more weight than any revenge she might have dreamed of during the long years of humiliation and pain. Margaret looked up at her sister with eyes full of tears and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The first crack in the wall she had built around her heart all those years ago, and she squeezed Rosa's hand like a drowning woman grabbing a lifeline. Daniel watched from the sofa, knowing he had done what he needed to do, knowing that his time on this earth had not been wasted, and he smiled as he saw 2 women who should have been sisters all along finally begin the long journey toward becoming the family they were always meant to be. In the months that followed, before Daniel finally slipped away on a peaceful autumn evening, with both his mother and his aunt holding his hands, he watched Margaret transform from a woman consumed by pride and prejudice into someone capable of acknowledging her mistakes and asking for forgiveness. And he knew that his father's secret had finally served its purpose. Rosa moved out of the servants' quarters and into the main house, not as a maid but as a sister, and though the road ahead would be long and difficult, both women were finally willing to walk it together, bound by blood and something even stronger than blood. The choice to love despite everything that had come before. Moral: the people we look down upon may be the very ones closest to our hearts, and forgiveness is the only bridge that can carry us from hatred to healing.